The Killing Sea, Chapter 16. While Ruslan went in search of coconuts, Sarah went to find a secluded place to go to the bathroom. On her way back, she momentarily lost her way and came across a well with a plastic bucket still attached to a rope tied to a wooden beam. She tested the well water. Salty but clean. Sarah looked around. Nobody was in sight. She stripped down to her bikini bottoms and gave herself and her clothes a good soak. She washed their clothes first, stomping on them with her feet to try to clean them of the dirt and mud. After draping them on the cement lip of the well, she hoisted the bucket of water and poured it over her head. The cold, delicious rush of it on her sunburned skin made her shiver. After several more buckets, she put on her wet clothes, thinking wistfully of the dry clothes back home in her closet that she hardly ever wore. She had just tugged on her t-shirt when she noticed, out of the corner of her eye, shadows moving furtively among the palm trunks, moving toward her. She instinctively screamed. Ruslan charged in from out of nowhere with a yell, his machete raised. 2 men had emerged from the palms. One of the men yelled something back at them. He stopped and lowered the machete. After an exchange with the men, he said to Sarah, "It's okay. They didn't mean to scare you. They're looking for help." "Oh, sorry." She noticed that the 2 young men were twins, identical down to the fuzzy mustaches they were trying to grow. The twins joined the camp. Sarah's damp clothes chafed her, but that was nothing compared to her aching muscles and cuts. She and Aisha coaxed Peter into swallowing a few mouthfuls of coconut. Then there was nothing else for them to do but try to sleep and wait for morning. Peter fidgeted with a constant coughing. His hot, dry skin felt like paper. Ruslan said something to Aisha, who nodded, and he slipped out into the night. Where was Ruslan going? In the constant step-by-step struggle to make progress to the doctor at Kalan, Sarah hadn't given him much thought. But he'd been there to help rescue Peter from the surf, and he'd rushed in with the machete when 2 strangers had appeared. His absence now made her worry. She didn't feel as safe. A minute later, though, he returned with a bucket of water. Aisha tore part of her headdress into a handkerchief and dipped it into the water. She placed the wet cloth over Peter's forehead. "Thank you," Sarah said, reaching for the cloth. "But let me do that." Aisha gently pushed her hand away and said something, which Ruslan translated. "It's going to be a long walk tomorrow. She says you need your sleep." Ruslan's voice came across a vacuum. Sarah's mind seemed to be bubble-wrapped with fatigue. The tsunami had happened to another girl. She was just a hollow copy. She'd sleep for an hour and then wake up to take her turn nursing Peter. When she did wake up, it was dawn. Peter seemed to be sleeping deeply, although his breathing was wheezy and he was still hot to the touch. Ruslan and the twins were outside the tarp tent, murmuring their prayers, kneeling and bowing on the ground. What good would prayers do? If she had gotten on her knees and prayed, would an angel appear and touch Peter's brow to make him better? Or maybe say, "I have a surprise," and then their mother would walk in? Her mother, her own mother, was dead. Odd how she still felt nothing. Aisha ducked under the tarp, with Surfcat at her heels. She held a twisted white root the length of her palm. She washed it and ground half of it up between 2 rocks, then mixed the ground root into some coconut milk. "It's jamu for Peter," Ruslan said. Jamu is traditional medicine. This is for fever. She says the cat led her to the plant. She thinks the cat is a devil? Peter's eyes flew open and he sat upright. "Surfcat is not a devil." Ruslan lifted a hand. No, not a bad devil. We call it a djinn." "Genie," Sarah said. She stroked Surfcat's fur. "He is a little strange." Peter scowled. "He is not." That scowl cheered Sarah. Some of her old brother was still there. The band started hiking again. An hour later, with the blue sky already exuding an oven's heat, they came to the remains of a fishing village. A man squatted on his haunches in the middle of one foundation, idly scratching in bare cement with a rusty nail. He glanced up at the passing group, watched for a second with a deadened expression, not even registering surprise at the sight of 2 Western children, then threw the nail away to join them without a word. Other survivors joined. A middle-aged man with lopsided glasses, one of the frame's earpieces having snapped off. A woman and her elderly but wiry mother. 2 more men with one of the men's sons who looked hardly any older than Ruslan but already wore a wedding ring. Another girl wearing shorts and a dirty towel over her shoulders to cover her budding breasts. She appeared oblivious to most everything, never speaking a word. Whenever the band paused, she squatted and pulled the towel over her head as though to hide herself. The middle-aged man, who carried himself with professorial dignity despite his lopsided glasses, and whom the others respectfully addressed as Baba, shook his head and said to Sarah, "Mama, Baba, family, Semua Habis." His hands translated, all gone. Later, it would seem to Sarah that these survivors had all joined at the same time, but in fact, they drifted in over the course of that day and the next. She couldn't remember when exactly, except for the mute girl. She was the last, appearing out of a swamp toward the middle of the second day. Those 2 days were a blur of swamps and sunken beaches and drowned oil palm plantations. The struggle of each hour to get around or over or through some obstacle seemed identical to any other hour. Ruslan and the others, including the tiny but strong grandmother, took turns helping Peter. The hills of Kalan never seemed to get any closer. The second night they made camp in the ruins of a seashore mosque. Aisa ground up the remaining half of the root and gave Peter a second dose of the jamu. He seemed to be holding his own. At least his fever and his cough weren't getting worse. Maybe the root did help, even if it wasn't real medicine. By that time, Sarah was starting to think that perhaps Kalan had been destroyed like everything else around them. But there were those hills, though, with visible tree lines. The man in that paddle boat seemed confident there was a doctor. The hospital had to be on one of those hills. She asked Ruslan about it before they went to sleep. He was laying on his back, staring up at the stars. Probably, Ruslan said, still gazing up at the stars. I don't know Kalan very well. Not really going there, but to a village in the hills, where my father is. And the rest of your family? Sarah asked delicately. No brothers or sisters. My mother died when I was little. Ruslan frowned and thought, maybe I'm lucky. Sarah understood the horrible logic of that, although she sensed a certain bewildered ache in his words that he should have had no mother at all. My mom drowned in the tsunami. He turned his head to look at her. I'm sorry, he said with honest simplicity. And then, what? The tsunami. It's a Japanese word for the big waves caused by earthquakes. Ruslan was silent for a moment. Is that what it was? What did you think it was? He rose up on his elbow. Any mom said God's punishment was coming. It was an earthquake, Ruslan. A longer silence. They didn't teach this at school. I didn't know what it was at first either. Ruslan slowly nodded. Your father? The question provoked a sharp anxiety. Dad, be safe, hang on. He's okay, except he broke his leg running from the wave. I had to leave him on Tiger Island to find my brother a doctor. You think they can organize a search party from Kalan? I'm sure they can, Ruslan said. Sarah did not allow herself to doubt Ruslan's reassuring answer. Of course they would. On the morning of the third day, the swamps at last gave way to higher ground, much of it planted with rice fields and now destroyed. The band made quick progress along the remaining footpaths through the fields. The hills of Kalan grew larger, and Sarah's hopes grew as well, only to be dashed when they came to an estuary and wide swamp too wide to ford. They would have to detour inland around it, adding another night to their trek. Toward sunset, as they approached a small knob of ground upon which a farmer had built a shack, a faint drone sifted into the dull quiet. Sarah looked up and saw a dark speck low against the reddening clouds. A small aircraft with a single engine and fixed wheels. The plane held a low and steady course just off the shoreline, and then abruptly banked and headed for the small band of survivors. It circled above them, descending lower with each circuit until it roared 100 feet overhead. Framed in the open side door was the photographer, his blonde ponytail whipping around in the wind as he aimed the camera at them. Help us! Sarah screamed, waving her own arms. Get us out of here! The photographer waved back. He lobbed something out of the plane that winked brightly as it fell to the ground 100 feet away, landing by a goat dead on its side, legs stiff in the air. Sarah raced over to the object. It was an almond and cranberry trail mix bar, looking as though it had come straight from the supermarket shelf. Sarah's mouth salivated. She tore open the wrapper with her teeth, the honeyed scent making her swoon. She was about to take the first wonderful bite when she stopped. Don't be so selfish, she could hear her mother say, one of her constant annoying mantras. Still, Sarah had the distinct and uneasy feeling right at this moment of her life that it was somehow in the balance. She could eat the trail bar, true, but afterward she'd forever be a certain kind of Sarah. Nonsense, a sly voice said. True, it was nonsense. Nonetheless, she broke the trail bar and gave Peter one of the halves. The other she offered to the silent girl. The girl sniffed it, nibbled a corner, and then crammed the whole of it into her mouth. Baba adjusted his glasses on his nose and scolded her, clearly telling the girl to thank Sarah. That's okay, Sarah said. She wished she had another bar to share. Maybe like Jesus with the bread and fishes, multiplying the trail mix until everybody had enough to eat. They climbed the 30-foot-high hillock, rising neat as a button from the flat fields. Its lower slopes had been planted with corn, the plants ruined by the tsunami. The hut was nothing more than a thatched roof on crooked poles with a rickety bamboo platform to rest upon. A stacked metal container held an untouched meal of moldy rice and greenish chicken legs. On the platform was an old shortwave radio. Bubba turned it on, and a voice crackled from the speaker, speaking a language Sarah didn't understand. The others gathered around to listen. Ruslan stood separate from the others, staring at the distant foothills. The way he was looking at them, Sarah became anxious. You'll help us find a doctor, won't you? She asked him. I mean, what if he doesn't speak English? Ruslan turned and looked at her. The low sunlight threw his cheeks into high relief, and his eyes. She hadn't really noticed before how deep and clear they were. Most doctors have some English, she said. But you'll help us? He pressed his lips together for a moment, and then he smiled, those eyes widening, light sparkling at the bottom of those black irises. We're helping each other. That reassured her. After a quick meal of coconut, Bubba discussed something with the others, and then spoke to Sarah. Ruslan interpreted, gesturing at the bamboo platform. You and your brother can have the bed. No, no, Sarah said, and put her hand on the grandmother's shoulder. Let her have it. The grandmother scolded her. The bed was Sarah's. Sarah knew that the only way she could repay the touching kindness was to accept it. Thank you, she said. Aisa picked Peter up and laid him down on the bamboo slats. How you doing, champ? Sarah asked him. Okay, he said, but the deepened flush of his skin and the listless, fevered look in his eyes told Sarah the truth. She kept her sense of helplessness at bay by thinking of the doctor at Kalan. We'll get you there tomorrow, she said. Sarah asked if she could borrow the radio. She spun the dial until she found an English news program. She learned then that the deadly tsunami had struck as far away as Thailand and India. Some commentators added their concerns about potential epidemics. One woman spoke of another danger, that of criminals presenting themselves as relief workers in order to abduct young orphans to sell elsewhere. The silent girl approached out of the night shadows and sat beside her. Sarah combed her matted hair with her fingers, working out the worst of the tangles. The girl slumped forward, sound asleep. Sarah put her down on the mat beside Peter and lay on the hard dirt floor, overcome with exhaustion herself. Peter was restless and coughing. His fever seemed to be climbing. Aisa had no more of the root to give him. She stroked his head and sang a lullaby. Bungong Jempa, Bungong Jempa, Mega Di Ache. The sweetness of it was nearly unbearable. Worry for her father returned with a piercing vengeance, and her mother, but to her horror, her mother's face was blank.